A few years ago, I came across this slab. It had a rotted hole in the middle, but had some unique characteristics in it. I bought it. It's been sitting in my shop for a while. I finally had a use for it, so I got it out about 2 weeks ago and started working on it, and we finally got it done. Take a look at the video here, and I'm gonna show you how it's made. So I have a really unique project here I'm getting ready to start, and I wanted to share it with you guys. And it is going to be turning this, what they often refer to as a cookie, be a cross section of a tree. That this one had a hole in it, and this is a piece of maple, and we're going to turn this into a coffee table. It's going to be a pretty nice sized coffee table. We're going to add some epoxy in here, and we're going to actually have that epoxy flow out this crevice here and kind of make it look like this is a lagoon and this is a river feeding the lagoon. And it should turn out really cool when it's all said and done. So let's get started. So the first thing we're gonna do is I gotta get all this debris out of here. There's a bunch of pieces that have fallen off the edge of here. And then I need to build essentially a dam on the open end so that I don't lose all my epoxy out that end. So we're gonna do that, and then we will get into actually pouring the epoxy. Now, I've never done anything like this, but I have a pretty good plan in place. So we're gonna see, hopefully this works. Basically, I'm just marking a piece of cardboard and gonna get it set for a form. This is the end. So we're going to cut this piece of cardboard. So it's going to be something kind of like that. I'm actually going to coat this with this red tape so that it won't adhere to the epoxy. So one thing I gotta make sure of is that everything that's gonna have epoxy is actually on the table. Because this is an odd shape, you gotta double check the bottom. I gotta double check where this mouth is going. And I think I'm gonna need to turn it a little bit. Maybe not. I think it's gonna have to go more like this. Because I don't want it leaking all over the floor. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little silicone here. And I'm going to put it on the ends where it meets the board. And I want to put some along the bottom. I'm just not sure how that's going to work. So, oh, that came out a little fast. That's okay. I may just put some along here where I anticipate it to be. Just to help seal it. And it's gonna be a little messy, it looks like. So I'm actually gonna take some tape . Tape this in place. So if you've seen any of my other videos where I work with epoxy, you'll know I don't do anything to seal this wood off so that the epoxy in the middle will flow out. The technique I've learned to use is to come in with a light layer, coat all the edges, and it'll puddle in the bottom and it'll seal itself. If you don't pour a lot, it won't push out. But if you do pour a lot, all that weight will force it up underneath and you'll lose a lot of epoxy. This is kind of a mess. It's going to be spongy, I have a feeling. It's going to soak up a lot, even out in here. It's going to soak up some epoxy. And so it's going to take a little bit here for me to prepare this the way it needs to be. I'm going to do some small pours. You do not want any of this on a deep pour to be previously unexposed epoxy. The epoxy seals off all the air pockets. If you don't seal it off, it'll bubble like crazy, and it'll do it at the most inopportune time, which is usually right as your epoxy is starting to cure. So that's why I like to, especially in stuff like this, go in smaller increment pours so I don't have that kind of problem. But you're going to see here, we're going to start filling all this stuff in. Anywhere there's some soft, kind of probably decay and stuff like that is what's causing it from when the tree was dying. But we're going to stabilize it with some epoxy, and then we'll sand it all after the fact. So that's what we're going to do first. Okay, I have a few areas that I want to fill that will not get color. So I'm going to dress those first. And I'm just using like just a syringe. It makes it easier to pinpoint the exact spot you want to drip it in, so you don't make quite as much of a mess. I'm just trying to fill in these little holes, this knot that formed. Sometimes this is a lot longer task than you think because these holes go way down in, but it's kind of a necessary thing to do, especially for a tabletop, because nobody wants a tabletop with holes in it. If you go to write something, it ends up being a problem because your pencil gets down in the cracks. We'll let that soak in. I got another one over here. This one goes pretty deep. Looks like a wormhole of some sort. And then push a little bit down into these because I know they're just going to soak it up. The coloring doesn't matter. I am going to color this blue here in a minute, but this coloring here is not going to matter. Start getting it, soaking it. This is all kind of spongy. I'm gonna let it sit and work its way down in. As I started using the syringe and filling in areas, I realized that there was a lot of really soft areas, spongy kind of areas, even further out from the center. Just based on experience, I've known that if you just apply epoxy to those areas, it tends to discolor, and you'll be able to tell where you stopped. So what I decided to do was just spread it out, and I'm just using a Bondo type of spreader, and I spread it out over the entire surface of the top. And my hope is to get more of a uniform color. I had every intention when I started doing this of sanding this thing, planing it down after the fact, so I knew that it shouldn't
have an issue with the finish or anything like that. It was just to help get a little bit more uniform color over everything and not just have like a spot that looks darker and wet in one area. After letting the top coat dry, I came back, I mixed up some more epoxy, and I added a little bit of blue to it. And now I'm going to get into really trying to get it down into the cracks and crevices along that edge. There was, because of that center of the tree being dead, there was a lot of areas like little holes and stuff that needed filled. And I wanted to get a little bit of color into there because eventually, I want it all that epoxy to look blue or different shades of blue. And so I'm just kind of pouring it around the top right now and letting it flow over the sides. And my whole intention here is to get it to fill some of those cracks, and anything that doesn't fill to overflow and just at least seal right around the edge of the bottom. And the reason for that, as I mentioned previously, is by getting it to puddle right around the edge of the bottom, it makes it so that I don't have to worry about the following pores seeping out underneath. It seals it seals the wood in that red tape and makes it so it doesn't go through. I used to actually put some silicone on the underside of the table or whatever it is I was running epoxy on, and when I discovered doing this, I realized that silicone step was an extra step I didn't need to do. It was kind of messy, and so this works really well, and I just got away from doing it the other way. So we'll finish pouring these out, and then we'll move on. To get a good water look, I like to use at least 2 different colors of blue, one for the shallower water, one for the deeper water. So I'm going to mix up 2 colors of blue right here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour the darker blue kind of in the center of that lagoon type area, and the lighter blue around the perimeter of that, and then I'll run that darker blue the whole way out to the edge where we made that little dam with the cardboard. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep doing that and adding layers and layers and layers until we get to the depth we want. Now, if you're doing this, you're going to want to maybe decide how transparent you want those layers to be. If you don't put much powder in there, you can make it so you can see pretty far down in or possibly the whole way through. If you put a lot in, then you won't be able to see very far into it. I think especially as you get to the top, it's nice to maybe use a little bit less. It builds a little depth into everything, but it's kind of just your personal preference. Now, I am mixing with a paddle type mixer, like a paint mixer, in my drill. When doing this, it adds a lot of air bubbles into the mix. So that is something that you're going to probably have to fight a little bit if you do it this way. You'll still get air bubbles if you hand stir, but you will get less. So you'll see here as we go on, we'll take care of those air bubbles, and it turns out fine. It's just a little bit quicker way to do things. So as you can see the air bubbles here, we just use a heat gun and just blow it on there. I have it on the higher setting, and it works quite well. I have used torches in the past. You just have to be really careful with a torch because you can actually scorch the epoxy a lot easier. You could kind of scorch it with a heat gun as well if you hold in the same spot for too long, but a torch, it's a lot easier to mess things up accidentally than it is with the heat gun from what I found. Plus, the heat gun has 2 settings, at least the one I have. I can put a link down in the description for the heat gun I use, but any heat gun will work, and it works quite well. As you can see, those bubbles pop right off. So after letting that coat dry, I just went back and mixed some more and poured in another layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep doing this technique the whole way up through. We're going to mix 2 colors. We're going to pour. We're going to let it dry. We'll pop bubbles first. Then we'll let it dry. Then we will start all over again until we get this thing filled up to the top. So we're going to just cut away here and let you enjoy watching this epoxy pour out, and we'll get on to the last steps of finishing up this table. After pouring that last layer in, it was time to demold, so obviously I let it dry first. I pulled off that cardboard dam that we made and tried to get most of the tape off. Didn't all come off, but then in order to bust it free from the table, I usually use shims, and these are just your typical shims you could get in any kind of hardware or home improvement type store, and just drive them up underneath. Now this one, I was having a little bit of trouble getting it to pop free, so I used the claw of the hammer. I knew it was, going to be the bottom side, so I wasn't worried about damaging it, and I was still careful. But I used that claw, and I shoved a thicker piece of wood up underneath to create some space because it just wasn't quite popping free. Then I got over to another side, drove it in, and it came right up. So as you can see, when I flip this over here, that the bottom contained all of the epoxy right near the center where we wanted it. We didn't have a whole lot of waste or anything like that. So it turned out exactly how it should have, and we're ready to take it to a sander. Now, usually for larger projects, I take things off-site to get sanded. It just takes way too long to do it all by myself with a random orbital sander. I usually try to avoid belt sanders because you can a lot of times do more damage than good. So I took this to a local Amish shop that has a planer and a sander all in one, and they can do up to I think it's 42 inches or something like that. So we were able to get this whole thing smoothed out and sanded. The machine did leave a little bit of machine marks in, so I always come back in, and now they sand to about 120 grit. I always come back in and start with at least 120, sometimes even go less, and I sand both sides really well up to 220. The top, usually I go a little bit further, like maybe 320 grit, and then I stop. So we're going to get that sanding done, and it's a good idea, just a little tip here. Use an air hose if you can. I don't care if it's hooked up to a shop vac or dust collector. It doesn't really matter. Before I had a dust collector, I use a shop vac. But to be able to suck the air off of that, or the dust off of that sander, it makes a quality difference. I highly recommend trying to do that if you can. Next, I just get a rotary tool out and I get a sanding flap wheel on it, and I just sand the entire edge of the slab. And I do this with all my live edge. There's always a little bit of loose bark residue on the edges, and it's just, I think it's good to take that off because I don't think it's going to stay on there long term anyways, and so it may affect the finish. I also take that sander and I just lightly go put a small bevel on the top edge, and I don't want to get a router out because some of those areas it wouldn't actually be able to go in and route, so I think a sander is an easy way to just knock the edge off, make it a little bit safer, so if someone were to hit their head on it, it hopefully wouldn't at least gash them open from a sharp corner. Now, when sanding epoxy, I sometimes, even with that Festool sander, which is supposed to be a really good sander, I get small swirl marks sometimes in the epoxy. So one way I've found to get some of those out is just by using a polishing compound and just buffing them out, like you see here. It does a nice job. I try to only keep it on the actual epoxy. I try to avoid buffing on the wood, but I get a lot of those real fine marks out of there. Otherwise, I mean, you could probably sand to a really, really high grit and get them out, but this is just a little bit quicker way. The sanding to a high grit then really isn't that necessary, and this only takes a few minutes to do. For finish, I like to use a product called Odie's oil, and it's I believe it's like a wax mixed with an oil. You apply it with a Scotch pad, and you just work it in a circular motion really well into the wood. You want to really try to work it down into the wood fibers. It gives you a really nice finish, a good low sheen, so you can see all the grain characteristics, and it just does a really nice job. I go over everything, including the epoxy, and what you typically do is you're just going to work it in, and then you're going to let it set for a few hours, make sure everything's covered real well, and then all you have to do after that is buff it out. It's a little bit of hard work. You could actually use a power buffer probably. I usually do it by hand, but you kind of have to rub pretty hard. If you let it sit too long, it's like, you know, when you wax a car, it tends to harden and it gets a lot harder to get off. So I highly recommend working within the time constraints that it says on the jar. And I'll put a link to this product in the description. And if you use it and have any questions, the company is very good about replying. I've asked questions in the past for more commercial use in restaurants. They reply really quickly with a lot of information. I was actually applying this incorrectly at one point in time, and it was kind of a monkey see, monkey do. I saw other people spreading it out with like a spreader, like a Bondo spreader, and they sent me a message. They saw my video, or it was like an Instagram post, and they just said, "Hey, this isn't quite the way you should do it. You waste a lot of product doing it this way." And then they told me about using the Scotch-Brite pad and really working it into the wood fibers and wood grain, and I've gotten a lot better results since then. So it's a very good company, a very helpful company, and I highly recommend them. So now it's time to bolt on the legs. And I had some custom legs made just because it was such a weird shaped top. I thought I had to get good support. I didn't want it to tip in any of the corners. So we just pre-drill the holes. Always make sure when you pre-drill a hole that you don't drill too far and go through the top. And then we just bolt them on with bolts. And they're kind of just usually use like a lag bolt, and it's good to go.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something. If you have any questions, drop them down there in the comment section. I'll get to them and try to answer them. I hope you really just enjoyed this. This is actually heading to Florida tomorrow morning, and it's going to be sitting in our vacation home down there that we rent out as an Airbnb. So hopefully a lot of people will get some enjoyment out of this table. And aside from that, there's going to be a few videos here on the screen. Take a look at them, watch them. I appreciate y'all, and we'll see you next time.